Hey there, and welcome back. So before we begin backing up our project files, what we need to do is learn what a repository is and how we create one. So the repository is basically a location where our project files and data will be stored. It's just going to be an online storage service essentially for the project. And there's a few components we need to set up before we can create the repository. So the first thing we want is an application which will control this for us. Now, I've experienced a lot of the different types of providers and applications which we can use. So we have one type of approach which is called an SVN, and there's the application I used when I experienced that was Tortoise SVN. So if you don't know what that is, then feel free to Google it. I'm not going to go into that because I wasn't a huge fan of that, and I found that to be the more cumbersome option to go through. You've then got a very popular one which is Git. So you've probably heard of the GitHub, and they provide their own application to manage the data. So they've got their Git application, which again I've used. That one worked a little bit better, but the best combination I've found is what we will be looking at. Is the application source tree, which you can find on this website, the atlassian.com. Just follow this link and you can download for free. So in fact, that should be the first thing you're doing. So if you've never come across this before, get to this link here. I'll provide that in the course details as well for you to copy in. Give the source tree application a download, so get that downloading and install that. So pause the video whilst you're downloading and installing, and then come back when you have all of that set up. Okay, so this is a very simple application to install, which is why I didn't run through the steps with you, but I hope that at this point you have the application installed. Once you do have that installed, if you launch the application, you should be greeted with something like this. So this is our source tree application, which we've now got loaded. And this is the location where we store and create our repositories, or one of the places that we can create the repositories. And now the brilliant thing about this is I have a large number of repositories set up on different locations and different accounts depending on who I'm working with. That also means that I can save space. Rather than having the projects lying around on the PC on the hard drive when I'm not using them, I know that if I finish with the project for a while, what I can do is I can commit everything to the repository. I can then remove the information from my hard drive, so that is then freeing up space to work on something else. And for instance, what I have now is I just have 2 active repositories. So these are the things that I'm currently working on for sure. Everything else can be removed and stored in the background. So this is an example of what we'll have when we've created our first repository. We'll have a repository showing here and a list of commits and information of the project itself. So that's the first step done. We need source tree. Now, with source tree installed, we want to come over to a website called Bitbucket. So find bitbucket.org. And if you've never come here before either, what you'll need to do is you will need to set up a free account. Now, the reason I use Bitbucket is initially when I was searching for this, they provided the largest amount of free data storage online. So it was a couple of gigabytes, I think, which is more than enough for what you'll need. And this is my main account, and I've got a lot of my projects up here. I've got some more repositories stored away as well, but you can see here that I only had 2 on my system, but I've got a lot more ready to be used and called if I wanted to start working on them again. So once you have the account created, again, it's a very simple process. You say sign up, add your details, and there's no payments or anything needed. You'll be redirected to the dashboard. So this is our dashboard. If you press the Bitbucket button, and you have a list of repositories, and obviously at this point you may not have one, but that is fine. That's what we'll be setting up in the future lecture. So that is the second stage done now. So you can see this is quite nice and simple to set up. We have downloaded a application, an interface for our repository, and we have signed up to a provider for the data storage for the repository, which is through Bitbucket. And the other thing is I found that source tree and Bitbucket work really well with each other. You can use different repositories and different providers. They tend to all sync up somehow, but some of them just seem to have, from what I've seen, work better together. And if you look down here, that's because we can see that the Bitbucket's provided by the same people who make and provide the source tree application. So they work together very hassle-free, which is nice. And finally, what we want to do, so this will just be a Google page. So if we go to Google, and I'm doing it this way because these links will stay fairly set on what the URL will be. However, this may change, so I just want to show you a way to find this. But what we're looking for now is an ignore file. It's called a git ignore file, and what we'll do is we'll be putting this into our root directory in the project, and this will make the repository ignore certain files. And the reason being is purely that we don't actually need all of the content inside of the project folder to be put on the repository. Just a very quick example would be, for instance, if you were to, and you shouldn't, but if you were to build .exes into the project folders when you're testing or something, that doesn't need to be on the repository. If you wanted someone else to take your project and start working on it, they don't need your .exes to make the project run, so that's just wasted space. And I'm not going to go through it in detail because you'll see in a moment that there's a lot of different files which we don't need, but just feel free to look through them if you wanted. Do have a read through and see what kind of files are being ignored, but just take it as a given that you definitely do need something like this, because otherwise the repository is going to become gigabytes and gigabytes of data really quickly when it doesn't need to be that big. So all that we need to do is go to Google and search for UE4 git ignore. And at the moment it's the first github.com, and it should be under Sam Chef for the provider. So click on this link and we'll go to his git ignore post. And there's two ways we can do this. So if you haven't used GitHub before or downloaded things like this in the past, we can either clone or download. So cloning is something we do if you already have the source tree application or something like it set up, or we can just simply download a zip version of it, which will give us a text file which we can load. The other option is if we open the UE4 gitignore.gitignore, which is the bit we're interested in. This is a list of everything that will be ignored from the project. So other things you might be familiar with are the .dlls, the .sln, the solutions for the Visual Studio's launcher, and many other files will be in here, file types that is, can be ignored, which don't need to be constantly updated on the repository. And the way that I tend to do this so that I can just name the file immediately is I'll open up a text editor. For this one I've gone with Sublime Text, and simply from the very top line, including the # compiled object files, so all of this is context specific, that needs to be written this way for the repository to know how to read the information. And we're going to drag select down to the bottom of the page, Control C, open up your text editor again and just paste that in, and that's really all we needed to do. And then we just want to save this file, and the place that I want to save it is I will navigate to my projects, my UE4 file, and remember we've called this the Space Shooter template. And then what we want to do is when we are in the root directory of this, so the very base of this, we're not going to go any further than the initial folder itself for the project. We want to call this .gitignore. So just before I do hit save, the important thing here is that it is a gitignore, a .gitignore file, written and spelt that way. And in fact you can see that that's already the case here. So make sure it's written and spelt like this. Hey there, quick update mid-video. So I realised after recording that I had left the .gitignore file to be called gitignore.gitignore, which is incorrect. As we can see on my screen here now, what you should have is a file with no name and simply called .gitignore. Otherwise sometimes it won't be picked up, so that's also important to make sure you have that correct. Now, if like I did, you left it named as something and you try to remove that name, you may find that Windows will give you an error, so I'll just show you that. So this was the name of my file originally, which was incorrect. If you were to simply try to delete that and then save it as a .gitignore, Windows may not necessarily know what that is, and you'll be told that you need a file name. Now there's no other way around I can find for this than simply copying the content from your file, creating a new document, pasting that into it, and then saving this. I'll just remove that. Saving this out as the .gitignore that you want with no name
in front of it. We can say we'll replace that, and we can see that that has then saved perfectly fine. So that's how this should be saved, and that is how you get past that Windows error if you come up against that, and I will leave you to get back onto the rest of the video.
So we now have the gitignore file inside of the project, and that sets us up ready for the next lecture where we'll be finishing this off. We'll be creating the repository and we'll be backing up all of our data. So I'll leave that there for now, and I will see you in the next lecture.